and so that we can get through all of the things that we have to discuss today. I'm very excited to get to talk with you all. I've seen lots of people um, contacting me to be involved with this workshop, and I'm really excited to hear more about your organizations. Um, so today, um, I am going to start by kind of going over the agenda and objectives for today, tell you like what we're going to talk about. And then I also want to take a moment to explain how we're going to ask questions and chat and make this an interactive workshop. Um, for those who know me, my preferred facilitation style is nothing like this. It is much more interactive and in person and has flip charts and markers and activities. But I'm going to do my best with what we have available to us right now to make this as interactive as possible. So as I go through section by section, I'll be taking questions. And in any other time when you have questions, I'm going to ask that you use the raise hand function um, in the participants bar. So for anybody who hasn't maybe made themselves completely familiar with Zoom, if you go click on the people on the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon that looks like two people that says participants. Then if you click on that, you should be able to raise your hand. The raise hand function will usually be next to your name, but it can also be sometimes in the bottom of the participants bar screen. And so if you could use that function to raise your hand, one of my colleagues, Meg, who I will introduce in a moment, is going to be helping me keep track of who has questions and in what order. And then I will call on you and you can turn on your video and ask your question. And that way everybody can hear the questions and we can make sure that everybody has the space to speak. There will be times like if we have a brainstorm, that's a great place to use in the chat, but I'd really prefer that you raise your hand and put on your video and ask the whole group if you have any other questions. And again, I'll take questions at particular moments. Okay, so I'm gonna start with introductions. So again, my name is Erica Bridgman. I'm the Small Grants Fund Manager at the Portland Children's Levy. I've been there about 6 months, and it is my job to help kind of launch this new small grants fund, which we're really excited about because it's an opportunity for us to fund organizations and communities that we haven't been able to reach before. I'm also on the call with Meg McElroy. Can you show yourself to us, Meg?
Hi, everyone.
There she is. Meg's the assistant director at the Levy, and she's the one that's going to be helping me take stack. And then Mary Gay Broderick. Can you turn on your video, Mary Gay? Mary Gay, there she is. Mary Gay is the director of communication. She's been helping us navigate all of these challenges with Zoom and whatnot. And she is also going to be co-hosting and letting everybody into the meeting. Okay, so yeah, we don't have any other PCL staff on the call right now. So could we ask that, let's see, those of you who are participants from the organizations, I'm going to call on you in the order that you appear on my screen. Just introduce yourself, so your name and your organization. That's like really all I think we're gonna have time for right now. But let's start with Carol. You want to introduce yourself, Carol? Studentmund, I think. I may have not massacred that.
Erica, she's from closed caption, so she doesn't.
Oh, Carol's from closed captioning. Okay, So Danielle.
Hi, good morning. My name is Danielle Schneider, and I'm the Executive Director at the Blosser Center for Dyslexia Resources.
Great, thank you, Danielle. Joy.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joy Mulumba. I'm the manager at African Family Holistic Health Organization.
Thank you. Oh, I also forgot to mention this. If you may also share your pronouns. Mine are she, her, and hers. Julia.
Hello, I am Julia Soto, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am the Partnerships Director at Portland Workforce Alliance.
Thank you. Lisha.
Oh, hi, everyone. My name is Lisha. I'm the Executive Director with Division Midway Alliance.
Thank you. Maria.
Hello, I think the video is coming. Maria with Resolutions Northwest, co-director of Restorative Justice.
Thank you. Nice background.
Thanks.
Marietta.
Hey, I'm Marietta. I'm the executive director at Play It Forward, and I'm she, her, hers.
Thank you. Michael Rosen.
Hi, I'm Michael, and I'm with Northwest Down Syndrome Association, and my pronouns are he, him, his.
Thank you.
On the air.
Michelle Welton.
She, her, and I'm the executive director at Grow Portland.
Thank you, Michelle. Tonya or Tanya? Nuts.
Hi, it's Tanya. I'm the president and co-founder at Project 48.
Thank you. Scrolling down. I think that's it.
Playing with 3 people. It's going to be fun. Lawrence, get off there with people.
Did I miss anybody?
Sorry.
Did I miss anyone? Okay.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Austin. I'm the Operations and Communications Coordinator at Division Midway Alliance.
Thank you, Austin.
And I'm Ashley. Oh, I'm Ashley. I'm Development Director at Urban Gleaners.
Thank you, Ashley. Oh, I see. I missed the A's somehow. Also, Soul River. I think that's Chad.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. My name is Chad Brown. I'm president and founder of the organization.
Thank you. Okay. Great. So we're going to get started. I'm going to share my screen. So I won't be able to see many of you. Oh, Mary Gay. Can you enable my screen sharing again?
There you go.
Thank you.
Hey, Erica, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a person with labeled as admin who has their hand up, and I'm not sure who is holding the admin label right now.
Okay. Go ahead with your question.
That was Ashley, and I had done that when we missed me earlier, and I didn't notice. I didn't put it down. Thank you.
Got it. Thanks, Ashley.
Great. So today we are going to, by the end of this session, you will be able to get questions answered about how to submit your application and when. You'll be able to ask questions about how to fill out the step 1 application, especially the parts that pertain specifically to Black, Indigenous, people of color, and disability. You'll be able to calculate the amount of the grant that you're eligible to apply for. You'll also be able to recognize whether or not you meet key eligibility requirements to apply, such as your organizational budget size and your program areas. And you'll know key deadlines in the Small Grants Fund grant making timeline. So we're just finishing with the introduction and welcome. I'm going to go over the application materials and the background of the fund. We're going to go over the program areas and then the eligibility and the grant award amounts, the deadlines and the timelines. We're going to review questions on the application and how they are scored. And then in the last meeting, we got through all of that and we still had extra time for just general discussion. If that happens again today, that will just be open. And so any like lingering thoughts or questions that you have that we haven't already covered, we can go through those at that time. Are there any questions about that before we dive in from anyone? Okay, Meg, do you see anyone? Okay, then I'm going to share my screen again, but let's see. Okay. So before you start applying for the fund for the grant, it's important to start by going through the Small Grants website, which is on the Children's Levy website. So if you go to the Children's Levy website and you go to available funding, you'll find the Small Grants page, which is where we are right now. And when you look there, there's a lot of really important information. So first of all, there's a frequently asked questions section down here. You see the FAQ. All of the questions that are on that FAQ, we will cover in the session today. But if you forget about something as you're actually filling it out, if you want to go back and start there, that's a great place to start to get your questions answered. The other thing that's important to see here is that you can sign up for the weekly newsletter. So as we're going through this process, if anybody has a question for me, you will email me your question, and then all of the questions that come in will be posted on a weekly newsletter that comes out every week. And so we can all see all of the questions that are coming in and we can all benefit from those answers. I'm hoping that in this next one that's coming, or the week after that, we will be posting all of the questions that come out of the information sessions, the one that happened last week and the one that's happening today, because those have unearthed some really good questions that we did not think about. So those will be posted as well. Okay. You can also here after today, there's a link to watch the playback of this session, and you can go there as well for any questions. This is where you will also be able to download the actual application and the instructions. We're about to go over the instructions first. They're really important. So if you are like me, and I'm a person that if I get IKEA furniture or something, I just kind of try to put it together before I look at the directions, I advise you not to do that with this grant. Because the information that you need really is in the application and the scoring criteria. And we've worked really hard to make it as explicit as possible, so it can answer all of your questions about the whole grant. So that is what is on this page. So hopefully by the end of today, many of you will have signed up for those weekly notifications. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this. And now I'm going to move to sharing the instructions. Oh, I see. That actually is back up here. Yeah, okay. Okay, so the purpose of the Small Grants Fund is to increase equity by investing in programs of small organizations that are arising out of marginalized communities that serve children, youth, and families who identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, immigrant and refugee, LGBTQ, Two-Spirit, IA+, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. And we really want to support the capacity of these organizations so that you can serve more children, youth, and families and improve the quality of services offered. I want to say that when we talk about supporting the capacity, that can mean, for example, if you work with a cohort of youth and you want to add another cohort, that's definitely growing capacity. But it could also mean maybe you want to work with the same cohort, but you want to be able to offer an expanded variety of services and focus on quality improvement and accessibility or responding to the crisis. That can also be part of what we mean by capacity building. So there's a lot of flexibility in that. The other thing to mention at this point is that we are specifically focused on small organizations. That means that there are organizations that have budgets of $1 million or less. But really, to qualify for this, as we'll talk about later, it needs to be between, your budget shouldn't be smaller than 30,000 and not more than $1 million. And that's part of the reason why we've developed the fund in that way, is because we need to not be more than 30% of your budget, but we also have seen that small organizations have had numerous barriers with accessing the larger Portland Children's Levy Fund. Okay, so before I go through the instructions, I want to pause here and see if there's any questions about anything that we've talked about so far on the website or anywhere else. And it's hard for me to see all the participants when my screen is shared. So Meg, do you see anybody?
Yep. No hands raised so far.
Okay, so now we're gonna go through the application. Okay. So we started with focusing, as I said, specifically on those cultural groups mentioned and on children and families and youth with disabilities. Are there thoughts from the community? And in this, you can use the chat because this is more of a brainstorm as to why it would be really important for us as the Children's Levy to focus on those specific communities for the Small Grants Fund. Need to make this bigger. No. One thing that we heard through numerous community conversations and through a community evaluation, a couple of community evaluation feedback processes that the Levy went through, was that not only had we not reached all of the cultural communities that I mentioned, but that also children with disabilities, and in particular children with disabilities in color, were especially underserved and faced kind of multiple levels of barriers because many of the culturally specific organizations did not necessarily have the capacity to respond to disability, and many of the disability organizations did not necessarily have the cultural expertise for all of the different communities that have children and youth and families with disabilities. So we went through a process where we had a design team, which are members of an ad hoc committee who helped us to design the small grants process. And they come from both public and private grant making and cover multiple cultural communities as well as LGBTQ and disability to help us think about how to design this fund and the process. We also had community conversations that many of you participated in to think about how to create this application. And part of that what came out of that is the two-step process. So if you are applying for this fund, it will happen in 2 steps. The first step is to complete this application that we're going through. And the questions on this are pretty basic, and we're not asking, at this time, we're not expecting you to have any specific tools. Like, for example, we do ask you how you would measure a specific thing. But if you were to say, okay, we would measure this with a survey or with interviews or any kind of tool like that, this in step 1, we don't expect you to have an interview guide or a pre and post test or anything like that. We just know that if you get funded, you will need to have those things in order to evaluate the outcome that you mentioned. So it's a basic application. And after step 1, the design team and reviewers recruited from the community will look at all the applications that came in and narrow down the pool to move to step 2. In step 2, you'll have an expanded application, which will include a budget and interviews with the specific organizations. And we thought for a really long time and discussed in all 8 community conversations how to make step 2 not be completely based on a written application, because we wanted to weight equity. We didn't feel like it was fair for the entirety of the evaluation to be based on an individual organization's ability to write a really good written grant in English. We wanted to give people a variety of different ways to be able to tell the story of their organization. But then we were also hit with a pandemic, which limited our ability to do many in-person interactive ways of storytelling. And so out of that thought came the idea of doing an interview, because an interview can be done in person. If that is something that's possible in October when these would take place. It can be done over the phone, it can be done over Zoom, it can be done with interpretation of any kind. And so we felt like that gave us the biggest ability to be responsive to the various needs we were hearing from the community. So in step 2, there'll be a more extensive written application that mostly is going to be giving us more information about your program budget. And there will also be interviews with different organizations. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the priority populations. So the next piece that I'm going to talk about are our program areas. And I'm just referring to my notes. Okay. So next I'm going over our program areas, and these are the specific areas that PCL is required to fund in. And the definitions are all here. Before I go over them, I want to say that I understand that many of you have kind of wraparound services or programs that might be a little bit one thing or a little bit another thing, and that's completely okay. You would want to apply in the program area that best fits your program. So for example, if you had a mentoring program that is working with kids weekly, but especially right now, you're also sending home food boxes, I would then apply in mentoring, not hunger relief, because the purpose of the program is really about the relationship between the adults and the children, and the food boxes are just an extra way that you're supporting the family. And so it's really about the core of your program. So hunger relief is here. It's a very broad program area. So that can include things like getting food boxes to families. It can also include nutrition education or gardening, anything that is about expanding the access to healthy and nutritious food to children. The after school program is one that we're going to have to do the most creative thinking about what this is going to look like in our post-COVID environment. But it typically it involves programs that happen after school hours during the school year. So it must include like after 3 p.m. on weekdays. It can also include like a spring break or a summer break program, but you wouldn't be able to apply for a program that only took place on spring break or summer. It does need to involve school year activities after school hours. The mentoring program is connecting children and youth with a caring adult. It can be like a one-to-one mentoring program, but it can also be a cohort. The thing that it cannot be is it cannot be a peer mentoring thing. So it wouldn't be like a program where you have like sophomores in high school mentoring middle school youth. That wouldn't fit into the category of things that we would fund. We would need the mentors to be 18 or older. Foster care supports the well-being and development of children and youth in foster care, and that one has the most flexible age range. So that can go from prenatal to age 24, and it's working with families and the youth impacted by the foster care system. Early childhood is prenatal through age 5, and this category isn't for like daycare because we have a whole other initiative through which we fund and support childcare that happens through the CC&R. It's called the Childcare Investment Fund. So there's a different route through which childcares are funded, but programs like parent-child play groups, a variety of other activities that support families. They can be home visiting programs that support families prenatal through age 5 would fit in this category. And then child abuse prevention and intervention. Often those programs, often the parents are the key participants, but it is any program that's really designed to prevent child abuse and neglect and to give support to those families to decrease their risks for child support. So I'm going to stop here and ask for any questions about the program areas.
Julia Soto has her hand raised.
Go ahead, Julia.
Hi, thank you. I had a question regarding the mentoring and if there was any further guidance and detail on what constitutes a mentoring program. And I give a little bit of context that if there was something that was after school that had mentoring components, or if the mentoring program was also focused on school success. So trying to differentiate between those two elements is what I'm driving at.
Mm-hmm. So in your mentoring program, the focus is like on school and academic success, yes?
Yes, and specifically career learning and trying to find successful pathways post graduation and to get to graduation.
And in a typical year, do you all meet at the school, or do you like, where do your activities take place?
They're usually taking place at various locations, sometimes at the school, but most often they're happening at like employer locations where students are learning about different career pathways.
And do you do things in the summer and during breaks, or mostly just during the school year?
Mostly during the school year.
I'm leaning towards after school from what you're telling me. So it would depend on specifically what project you are applying for in particular. but from what you're telling me, I'm leaning towards after school.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions about program areas?
Quick question. Chad has his hand raised from Soul River.
Go ahead, Chad.
Hey, yeah, the mentoring program, in regards to the mentoring program, the base of that has to take place around the schools.
No.
Okay.
For mentoring, for after school, it needs to be around the schools.
Okay.
For mentoring, it does not. Like the key piece about mentoring is that relationship between the children or youth and the adult, and then all the like empowerment pieces. So it's just about supporting their well-being through that relationship.
Okay, great. And the youth, is there a certain age on that youth? It doesn't matter.
Youth up to age 18.
80. Okay. All right. Awesome. Thank you.
Yes. Other questions about the program areas. Again, you can only submit one application because in the Small Grants Fund, we have pretty limited funding. We'd like to be able to support as many organizations as possible with what we have to work with. So each organization can only submit one application in one program area. Additional questions? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say no hands raised so far.
Okay. Okay, so we are going to move on. I don't want to spend too much time here, but if there are small organizations who do not yet have their 501c3 tax status and need to find a fiscal sponsor, these two organizations that are mentioned here are organizations where you can apply to have them as your fiscal sponsor. Before we would fund you, we would need to see that there was a letter or a contract or an MOU between you and the fiscal sponsor so that we can see how that flows. But that is there as a resource for anybody who needs it. Next, here we have some definitions that I'm not going to go into a lot at this time because I want to get to the budget piece, but we may come back to them later. But we're specifically looking at different types of organizations in this category. So disability-led, culturally responsive, culturally specific, and intersectional. I always miss it because it's right there on the top. The definitions are not perfect. In some cases, we've adapted from other organizations like the Coalition of Communities of Color, but those are the ones that we have. So when you fill out your application, there will be a box where you're clicking which of those best fits. You will not be scored based on which of those categories you fit into, but it helps us to track what kinds of organizations we are funding because we want to make sure that we're kind of covering these categories. Okay, so now we're going to work with the budget. So again, the way that the fund is set up within law is that you cannot request more than 30% of an organization's committed annual budget in a year. So the reason for that is that we don't want 100% of your funding to be based on the children's levy. And then if that funding isn't available in the next funding round, like we're not reauthorized, then your organization isn't able to kind of weather the storm and continue to do the great work that you're doing for the community. So in order to be sustainable, we're trying to be not more than 30% of your budget. And that's your committed budget. So that means like you don't have to, it's not necessarily the money that you've already banked, but it is the money that's committed. So if you are getting pledges or something like that, like there's sustainable funding, you can count a year's worth of those pledges. But it wouldn't be the same as projected. Like, for example, it's possible in January, someone projected to do a fundraiser and raise $20,000. And now that isn't happening because we had an unforeseen crisis. And so those aren't committed funds, those are projected funds. So it's based on your committed budget, grants that you know are coming in because you have a letter of support, pledges for all of that you have, that's the funds that are committed. Okay. Which means that, and the smallest size of a grant that you can apply for is $10,000. The largest is $60,000. Above $60,000 is where our large grants come in, and that cycle is closed for now. Okay, so we'll go over a couple of different examples that explain the funding for this. So if you're, in the first example, if your organization's committed budget for the next year is $300,000, 30% of $300,000 would be $90,000, but you can't actually apply for a $90,000 grant because the maximum we could give is $60,000. So instead, you can apply for $60,000. You may apply for $60,000 for each of 3 years. So that means that it's a total grant award of $180,000 over those 3 years. In the second, so you have a smaller one. So the committed budget is $50,000. The total they can apply for is $15,000, and they can plan their program activities for that $15,000. In example 3, you also see that you have the flexibility to take your total grant award and spread it unevenly across the 3 years. So we know there might be a lot of reasons why you might want to, for example, spend less in year 1. Maybe you have startup costs. Maybe you have to like hire new people to do something. And it takes a little time to hire and get your curriculum together and get everything kind of ramped up. So in that case, you might want a little less in year 1 because you don't have as much in personnel costs, but you would have more in year 2 and more in year 3 as you carry out your activities. Another thing that we know and that we're talking about how to accommodate is like your program activities may look differently in the first year because in a typical year, you wouldn't have any aspects virtual at all, but maybe in this first year, some of your activities will be virtual, which doesn't cost as much as doing an in-person activities, but you're going to be kind of doing a hybrid, and then it's going to become more and more intensive over the years. So you do have that flexibility to spread them out unevenly. Also, we know that small organizations have a lot of administrative costs. So you can have administrative costs of up to 15% of all your program costs, and that can cover things like client assistance. It can cover training for the staff. It can cover all of your mileage, your occupancy. If you have individual program evaluation needs, like you need somebody to help you set up some sort of database to track things, or you want to pay somebody to do some focus groups, those things can be covered in there, or some fiscal costs. So that can be covered under your admin costs. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and ask for questions around budgets.
I'm not sure who got there first, but Julia and Chad each have their hands up. So Julia, how about if you go first and then Chad?
Sure. Just a clarification on the administrative costs. Are all of those items bulleted considered administrative costs?
Client assistance and food for activities could be fit into program costs, depending on how you construct your program. Occupancy, insurance, office supplies, I would definitely put in the admin costs.
Oh, Erica, may I interject? Sorry.
Yes, Meg.
The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bullets are typically considered program costs when they're directly related to the implementation of the program activities. Administrative costs are typically defined as costs it takes just to operate the agency. So it might be salary paid toward the executive director, bookkeeping, overall insurance for the agency. It's sort of like what you can apportion to the cost of doing business, but all of the other bulleted things there can be billed if they are directly related to what it takes to operate the program itself.
Thank you for that clarification, Meg.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Chad, do you still have a question, or did that answer your question?
No, I have a question.
Okay.
The first three examples that you went over, is it safe to say that the what we're applying for is a 3-year grant or no?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. That's it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Okay. Okay, so last thing I'm going to do on this section is to go over the timeline. So right now, we're finishing up the applicant information sessions. Then we will be recruiting reviewers from the community. I actually want to say, if any of you all have ideas about how you would helping us to like outreach to reviewers, I am welcome to hear that. We haven't started with that process yet. We're finalizing our reviewer recruitment materials. However, we did hear a lot from the community conversations about the qualities of reviewers. And so we are looking for people who are reflective of the communities that we are trying to reach and who have experience with small organizations, who also have experience with the variety of cultural communities and the disability community. So we're looking for all of that to be reflected in our reviewers, so they have that background and expertise as they are looking at your applications together with the design team. In July, on the 8th, the step 1 applications will be submitted, and then we'll be doing some reviewer training. We need to train them on how to score the applications and also do some anti-bias training in that. And then in August, the reviewers and the design team will meet, go over scoring, and then we will get the recommendations. Well, at that time, the reviewers and the design team will narrow down the list from who's moving from step 1 to step 2. And the allocation committee will also meet to approve our process for the rest of the step 2. So at this point, we have approved these applications and these materials. More specific details for step 2, like the application for step 2 and the interview questions and all of that, has not yet been approved by the allocation committee. And that will happen during this time. Then in October, we will be, you will already, if you've been asked to move on to step 2, we will be contacting you in September. I don't know exactly the date yet, because some of those dates we're still figuring out, but it will be in September. And then you will be submitting the step 2 applications and also doing interviews in October. Then our hope is to have everything approved, all of the applicants and the awards approved by the allocation committee in November, and then finalized by the city council. That is going to be a 2-step process. So with the city council, there'll probably be 1 vote in December and 1 in early January. But all of the grant awards would start effective January of 2021. Okay, so questions about the timeline before we get into the application questions?
Tanya has her hand raised.
Yes.
Sorry, just to clarify, so if we're submitting a budget, it would just be a budget for 2021 and beyond, correct? For that 3-year mark? Would you want to see a budget for 2020 as like what we're operating on now, or?
So we would want the budget I was talking about most specifically is your program budget, but we will need to see financials for the organization. And I think that's going to depend on kind of what fiscal year you run on.
Okay. Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so now I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so I can switch to a different document. Oh, unless there's another question about that. Okay. So now we will go to, okay. So this is the actual application. The first couple of pages are really just demographic information about your organization. So it's your contact information, your organizational ID, the program area you're applying for, whether or not you have a fiscal sponsor, the types of organizations that you are. So that is pretty easy. But now we're going to look at the actual application questions. So once you download this from the website, you'll have to enable editing. And then once you do, you'll be able to type into these boxes and it'll expand. The word count for each question is here. So for this one, it's 200 to 325 words. And the first question is looking at, what is your organization's mission statement? What populations are you focused on serving? These are examples of populations, but please be as specific as makes sense for your program. So for example, if you are serving immigrant and refugee is a category, but if you're specifically focused on one particular immigrant group or one particular refugee group, you would want to name that rather than just say immigrant or refugee, especially if you're serving multiple ones. Children with disability. And then what are the benefits to children and youth or families for participating in your programs? And how do you reach low-income participants? So for this one, it is worth 19 points. 5 points are for the mission, 8 are for the population, and that's 2 points for each population up to 3 populations. And if you're serving more than 3 populations, if you're serving 4 or more populations, then you just get the whole 8 points. And 4 for benefits and 2 points for the inclusion of low-income families. And at the end of the applicant instructions, which we went over, you'll see the scoring criteria. And so it will say specifically, what do we think is a strong answer for this question? And what would be an insufficient answer for this question? So that's for question number 1. For question number 2, this is where you're going to tell us about your program activities. And specifically, what is unique about the way your program works? How frequent are your activities? And I know that what I want is for you to focus on what you're proposing. So it may have been that in the past you did things in a particular way, but in this question, I really want you to focus on what you're proposing to do in this application. And so that question is worth 10 points, and it's 8 points for the description of the activities, including how often, and 2, to see how well this fits with our program areas. The reason why we're focused on the frequency is because we know that with the populations that we're serving, that it's really important for there to be enough time to develop a relationship in order for there to be an impact. And so, you know, sometimes we might see programs where a volunteer might go into a school, for example, and do an activity with a child, but it might be only 2 or 3 times during the school year. And that's not enough to really be able to impact either that child's academic success or their overall well-being. So we want to see that you're with the children enough or the youth enough to be able to actually create an impact for their lives or their families or whichever outcome that you're trying to achieve. Let's see, the next question is about outcomes. So these are 2 outcomes or changes that you hope your program participants will achieve through participating in your program. And I've said it like program participants because in some categories, the program participants may actually be the parent. In others, it may be the child. In some programs, it might be both. So whoever it is that's taking place in your program, we want to know what those outcomes would be. We're only asking for 2. That doesn't mean that we don't expect you to achieve more, that we don't think that you will achieve more than 2 things. It's just for step 1, we only really need to know 2 things. And we want to know how you would measure it. So as I said before, if you say you're going to measure things through a survey, that's fine. And we don't expect you to have the survey all developed and attached to this application. We just know that if you down the road that you would need that survey in order to measure this outcome. So this will help us as we're thinking through what's going to be in the scope of work and your contracts down the road. So here are some examples. So you could say a participant increases the number of healthy, positive relationships they have through participating in our groups, or they develop skills in cooking healthy, culturally centered foods. And all of this could be measured through a variety of ways. So you could have focus groups with your youth beforehand or interviews saying, you know, do you feel like you have people that you can talk to? And that would be one way to measure it. You could also just have a form and say that ask that question. So it's up to you how you would do it, but what we're looking for are 2 outcomes and a way of measuring each one of those. Okay. These 3 questions are all questions that all organizations are going to answer, regardless of whether their focus is on disability or on Black, Indigenous, people of color. The next couple of sections the questions are slightly different depending on who is your population of focus. So before I go to those, does anybody have any questions about these 3 that apply for everyone?
Julia has her hand raised.
Sorry, did you say the scoring for number 3?
Scoring for number 3 is 10 points total. 5 points are for clarity and achievability of outcomes, and 5 are for evaluation methods.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Then I'm going to move on. So the next section is for organizations that are focused on Black, Indigenous, POC children, youth, and families. And I want to say both types of organization have exactly the same number of questions to answer, and the scoring is worth the same amount of points. It's just the wording of the questions is a little bit different. So for question number 4, list 2 steps you have already taken to be inclusive of participants in your program who have disabilities and why you chose those steps. And hold on, I have in here, I have my, here we go. Okay, so with disabilities, we are using the definition from the American with Disabilities Act, which defines an individual with a disability is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. That includes mental and physical disabilities, emotional disabilities. The major life activities include hearing, seeing, remembering, walking, climbing, bathing, dressing, and running errands alone as age appropriate in this case. We had a question at the previous information session about whether or not that included learning disabilities for school-age children, and the answer to that question is also yes. So to clarify, if you're an organization that's focused on BIPOC individuals, we're not asking you to start a separate program for children with disabilities. We're just asking, how do you include children who are from your cultural community or your community of focus who may also have a disability of some sort. So if you're a program that goes outdoors a lot, is there a way that children who have mobility challenges can engage in your programs? If you're an academic program, how are you working with children who have a variety of different cognitive disabilities, which could be autism, Down syndrome, any number of disabilities in that area. Our goal is to see that BIPOC children who have the additional layer and challenge of disability on top of their identity as being Black, Indigenous, person of color also have ways of engaging in these programs that you all have that are super empowering and culturally centered. And so we're just asking you to list 2 things that you have already done to make sure that to help children with disabilities from your communities be included in your program. And I will tell you the points just a second. I'm gonna switch to that. Okay. That one is worth 12 points and it is 6 points per step. Then the next question is list 2 additional steps that you would like to take to be inclusive of participants who have disabilities that you have not taken yet. And please explain, please explain why you chose these steps. Now, you could say, we would really like to widen the pathway in our community garden, but that takes financial resources that we don't have. And that is a perfectly valid reason why, and hopefully something that the funds through this would allow you to address. So if the reason is we didn't have the money to do it, or the reason is we took these steps and we had this plan and we just haven't gotten to these additional steps yet, all of that makes sense. Just please explain that there. Okay, and then number 6. Number 6 is not scored. This is for our information. And this is describing the types of technical support and your organization would need to carry out these steps in order to increase inclusivity. And that is for our information, because as we have been gathering data about technical support through the community conversations that the organizations might need, what I'm doing is looking at that and trying to understand what are the needs of the organizations that I'll be working with once you all are funded, and saying, okay, what things might you be able to cover in your grant, like through the administrative funds? What things might we have the capacity to help support you with within the children's levy or within the city? And what things might we have organizations or individual partners that could help you with that technical assistance, that I could connect you with those resources? So that just gives us that information so that I can start putting that together for you all. Okay, so I think I'll pause there and then we'll go and look at the disability questions. So are there questions about those 3 questions? Nope. Okay. So for the next one, for organizations that are focused on disability, we're asking you to list 2 steps you have already taken to be inclusive of Black, Indigenous children, youth, and families of color who have disabilities, and why you chose those steps. As and above, it's the same word count and it is the same scoring. So that means that it's 12 points. And then in the next question, again, we're asking you for 2 additional steps that you would like to take to be inclusive of BIPOC participants that you have not taken, and why. Same word count, same scoring, 10 points. And then also asking you about technical assistance. Okay, so that is the end of the application. And now I'd like to stop sharing my screen for a little bit and open it for kind of general questions and discussion about any of the things that we have covered to date. Julia, do you have your hand up or did you just not put it down?
I have it up again.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could give some examples of technical assistance.
Sure. There's lots of different forms. So it could be, we would like to be more inclusive in our after school program of children with cognitive disabilities, but our staff need more training in this area and we don't know where to get it. So that would be a form of technical assistance that I would put in. Or we don't know where to get culturally centered training in this area. Like we have a lot of children of color, but different cultural communities see disability in different ways. And so we don't know where to get that. Or it could be, we need some new kind of equipment and we have no idea where to buy it or who to talk to about it.
Awesome, thank you.
Chad has his hand raised too.
Chad?
Yeah, in regards to the disabilities, what if, is there extra points or the same amount of points that are established if you have the youth that are dealing with disabilities of color and also the adults that are part of that whole process, mentoring the youth under the mentoring program applying for that has disabilities as well?
I would very specifically call that out, and the points aren't different based on the adults or the youth, but from what you're describing, it sounds like you would get pretty much all of the points in that section.
Okay.
If you're doing it. And, you know, one thing that we also know is it talked about emotional disabilities in the American with Disabilities Act. definition that I gave. We were using the government's definition, which doesn't specifically call out trauma, but I do know that trauma disproportionately impacts our community and definitely can impact a lot of those life activities that was mentioned. And so if your organization's programs are geared around helping to address that, then I would specifically call that out as well.
Okay, awesome. And my last question, you just actually hit, is under the Disabilities Act. Is there any type of framework speaking to service dogs?
As a like an accommodation or an adaptation?
Yeah, I have youth and I also have vets that are working with working service dogs to help them with their disability.
So if you're already doing that, I would list that as one of the steps that you've taken, is that you have figured out how to integrate service dogs and working with that into your services.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I can see the questions now and I don't see any more. I covered a lot. I'm surprised none of you all have questions. Did I lose some people though? Am I not seeing everybody in the chat? Michael or Michelle, I haven't heard from you much. Do either of you have anything to say?
And Julia has her hand raised, and it looks like Michelle has raised her hand.
Okay, I'll call on Michelle and then on Julia again.
This may also be somewhere else, but is the scoring available in writing somewhere?
Yes.
Okay, I just hadn't dug in that deep yet.
Yes. So as I mentioned, on the applicant instructions guide, which is the first one that we went over, that is on the website, it's at the very end. So you'll see the whole guide, and then the scoring is at the very end.
Thank you.
Julia?
Yes, I had a question going back to the budget, on the committed organizational budget. If our organization holds a rather large event, it's not a fundraiser, there's actually, revenue or fees that participate, but those funds aren't actually secured until, December or January. Like, we won't have that. We have that projected, but it has a long history of success and revenue basis. Are we allowed to use that as part of a committed budget, even if we don't necessarily have everyone's affirmations or letters of support fully in yet?
I have a thought about that, but Meg, do you want to chime in?
So just to make sure I understand, Julia, a fundraiser that's typically happening at the end of the calendar year?
Yeah, usually in March. It's a rather large expo, and the fees generated are from sponsors and exhibitors that participate in that event.
And they don't cut you checks until the end of the year, even though they sign up to be part of that expo in March. You don't get the actual revenue from them until later?
We start to collect the revenue as soon as people sign up, but that revenue will go throughout a 6-month period. It will come in.
It sounds to me like people are committing to give you that revenue by committing to being a sponsor in the event. So I think it's reasonable to say that that is committed revenue.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Michelle, do you have another question, or did you not lower your hand? Okay.
Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
It's okay. I just wanted to make sure. How about anybody else that hasn't had a chance to speak or ask questions? Some of those quieter voices. So Tanya or Michael, I haven't heard from you yet.
I'm more quiet because we're a small organization, so I'm soaking it all in, but everything made really good sense. So I don't really have many questions. I printed out what you guys had on your website, so I got to see the scoring broken down too, which was nice. So I think we know where we fit, but other people are asking really great questions, so it's helping me too. So I would like to hear from anybody else if they have anything that maybe I haven't thought of. That would be
Tanya, can you tell me a little bit about your organization, your Project 48? Is that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know what that is.
We just launched, we aren't even a year in. We provide brand new bags of clothing, shoes, toiletries, and necessary items to youth coming into foster care right as they come into foster care.
Okay.
And we also have a COVID program working with New Avenues for Youth and the older kids, providing grocery gift cards and assistance to those that are aging out. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Ashley has her hand raised.
Thank you.
And I have children in the background, so apologies for the noise. I just have some questions about the reporting. If you guys have any estimations on what the time input on reporting, and basically kind of like not the accessibility of it, but we're a very small organization with little administrative staff. So that is a big factor for us. Have you guys done any sort of?
That's a really good question. And we haven't, so we're trying to make the reporting as simple as possible, given that it is also a government grant, right? Which is why I specifically called out, like, you may want to think about spending some admin dollars in evaluation. That being said, that's why we've been asking questions about outcomes that are pretty simple and would be simple to measure, so that when you do the reporting, like, you know up front, okay, if I said I'm going to measure like the amount of positive relationships that a child has through a survey, I do the survey at the beginning and the end, then you know how to measure that in a way that would be pretty simple in the recording. So I don't have all of the reporting pieces worked out yet, but we are trying to make it much easier in this case, because we know that the amount of funding that you're asking is much less than in the larger grants. So we can't do as elaborate, and the capacity as well. And I also am pretty committed to doing like periodic check-ins and doing it sort of verbally to make it easier. So I am committed to making it as supportive of a reporting process as possible. But that said, you know, you'll need to be able to invoice us. So there'll be some financial things that are due, and you do need to be able to track things. So if you are having students attend a certain number of classes or groups, you need to be able to keep track of how many people and the demographics of those people. So there's a little bit of tracking.
And do you guys have any thoughts on, is it going to be quarterly, or is that flexible, or will it be annually?
What I think it's flexible. We haven't really made that decision. In the large grants, there's a big annual report, but there's quarterly billing, you know, for the invoices. What's your thoughts? What would be easier for your program? I'm curious to hear from other organizations, their thoughts about that.
For us, I mean, quarterly is actually very frequent to be billing. Twice a year is manageable. And yeah, I mean, obviously we could make quarterly work. It's just, it happens very quickly, and it's pretty difficult to get responses back and, you know, accounting up to date and everything.
So I'm not sure about the reporting yet. The billing is pretty set because of how billing has to work, but I'm going to have to get back to you on the reporting. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Lisha with Division Midway Alliance. I have a question. I don't know, I'm not quite sure if you already talked about this at the beginning of your presentation. So once the organization get passed through step 1, and by that time, is that the time when we will get the application for step 2, or will that be available before, or is it already in the website? I have not checked everything yet. So
great question, Leisha. So when you get a letter from us that says your organization has been invited to step 2, you will also be getting the materials that for application. We'll give you like all of the information that you need to then prepare for step 2 at that point. But step 2 is invitation only, so it's not going to be generally available on the website.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? You all are a quiet bunch. Let's see, is Joy back? I haven't heard from him. Or let's see, Carol, Michelle, do you have any questions? I haven't heard from you. Joy.
Hey, Erica. Sorry, I have my son today, but I don't have any question at the moment. I feel like I need to process these on a deeper level and to imagine and envision a lot of these things before coming up with a specific questions. I feel like you've answered most of the general question I had. So this is great for me. Thank you for taking the time to do that.
Okay, so I want to remind people that if you have specific questions for me, it's really great to go back to the website, as I showed you, and sign up for those weekly updates, because as questions come in, we will be sending out in the digest answers to all of the different questions. Let's see, Maria, I see your message. Thank you. And that's good. I'm hoping that the differences in the questions between the disability and the BIPOC communities made sense to everybody. We didn't really have questions about that, and last time we had a lot. So if there's any other clarification about that, I can offer that as well. Otherwise, we can probably wind up here pretty soon. I do also want to remind everyone that, again, this presentation will be available on YouTube, and we'll be sending the link out, and it'll also be available on our website. Okay. If there's nothing else, then we can finish. Thank you, everybody. I'm glad it was helpful.